Well, it's a great pleasure for me to be moderating this session. It's a great pleasure to be at this conference. This is the third time I can say that the News and Finance Conference is the most enjoyable conference I've gone to now 3 years in a row. And I think it's a great credit to the organizers who really assemble an amazing group of people. The other thing that makes it so enjoyable is it's not just an academic echo chamber. It's a place where academics, journalists, and traders actually get together and talk about things that matter. I wish we did that more. So I really congratulate the organizers for making this such a fun and informative event. And it isn't easy, in case you ever have tried to do that, so 3 years in a row. I had the opportunity to talk with all the panelists over the phone, and I know you're in for a treat, so I'm going to try to keep my remarks to a very minimum. Let me just say what I think we're all going to talk about. What is fake news? Defining it is very challenging. Does it matter? You may have seen, in addition to Marina's wonderful paper about whether it matters for stock markets, there was a paper published by Dartmouth professor Brendan Nyhan in the New York Times just in the last few days, basically arguing that fake ads by Russia during the election couldn't possibly have affected anything. And in fact, generally, ads don't affect votes in elections, generally. So that was based on field experiments as well as analysis of the actual ads and who received them. So it's an interesting case where we have a huge amount of coverage of a topic, and the academic research, at least according to the Dartmouth professor, is telling us that we're wasting our time even worrying about it. In fact, the people who are doing the ads are wasting their time lying. Interesting. Another question, how does it affect your job? So we have people here who are representing, I would say, one way or another, representing or involved with the 4 of the most important brands in the media. And of course, part of what these brands are supposed to be doing is screening out fake news, giving us a reliable source to go to. And so it's really interesting, at least for me, to find out how it's affecting their jobs and how they see fake news from their own prism. How is journalism responding to fake news? What kinds of technological adaptations are there? You may have seen a couple days ago a story in the Wall Street Journal by someone named Gordon Krovitz. And Gordon used to be at the Wall Street Journal. He's left the Wall Street Journal, and now he is running a firm called NewsGuard. Anybody heard of this? What is NewsGuard doing? It's going to give publications green, yellow, or red scores based on a subjective evaluation of how reliable they are, and also provide what he calls nutrition labels for different media outlets. So obviously, the market's responding to fake news too, to try to create value in brands to help people be attentive to these differences. And finally, is this helping brands therefore? Because after all, brands are supposed to be an answer to fake news. Are they seeing this, is the market for journalism rewarding brands? So we have a great group of highly respected people from some of the top brands in journalism to address these questions. I won't introduce them because that's not what we do at this conference, but you can read their bios and be impressed. And I'll just go in the order that we agreed. So we'll start with, each of the panelists will make very brief opening comments, and then we'll throw it open to initial discussion among the people up here, and then to your questions. So let's start with Shannon.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me. So I cover the media industry, and so this has been the topic of fake news as a sort of a huge umbrella term that has probably popped up in more stories over the past year than almost anything else in terms of what I've been covering. And that's both on the actual journalistic organization sides, the publishers that I write about, and then of course advertising and social media networks, which I also write about. And I would say it's definitely probably would come as some alarm to some of the advertisers and platforms like Facebook to know that advertising doesn't actually affect people's votes, because they build a big business around that. I think one of the main conclusions I've come to at this point, if you can come to any conclusions about what fake news is that it's probably not a very helpful term at this point in our society in the way we report, in the way we're thinking about these things. Because if you look at all kinds of, if you look at all of the references that are made to fake news, whether it's the president, whether the way it's used in news articles, the way it's just used on social media constantly, you get this indication. People are talking about all kinds of different things. And so how can we even begin to think about solutions or how we might disincentivize, how we might think about financial issues around it if we can't even agree what it is? I would point to a recent survey by the Knight Foundation and Gallup that asked Americans, among other things, what is fake news? You may have heard the term. What do you think fake news means? And they gave them a variety of situations, and significant numbers of people, answered that they thought fake news was people knowingly portraying false information as if it were true. But they also included news organizations slanting their stories to promote a certain point of view, which is sort of a different way of thinking about fake news, and accurate stories casting a politician or political group in a negative light. So I think we're getting into these real problems where we have, so if maybe I don't like something that I read, and so it's easy for me to dismiss it as fake news. And that really undermines, I think, the important discussions that we should be having about the validity of sourcing, about transparency in journalism, about the difference between the sort of fly-by-night Facebook group that can be is created either whether it's by Russian propagandists or people just looking to make a quick buck off of advertising, and the way that in the environment of social media in particular we've collapsed the difference. It's if you're on your Facebook feed, that kind of information doesn't necessarily look a lot different than the article from the Financial Times or the New York Times or Bloomberg or the Wall Street Journal. So I think I think my challenge that I have in reporting on this and in talking to people and asking people is that we need to be much more specific about the terms that we're using, and probably just saying fake news in general isn't the most helpful thing. So that's what I would be most interested in hearing other people's thoughts about.
Great, thank you very much. Let's move on to Sarah.
Hi, everybody. I work for Bloomberg News, and I run the breaking news desk in the Americas. So me and my team, we're kind of on the front line of monitoring and reporting on all the information that comes in from a variety of sources. And where fake news comes into play most is with social media, which is probably no big surprise. And where we feel it most is with true hoaxes. When Twitter gets hacked and somebody tweets something that is a lie. And they do it on purpose. So that's the fake news that I run into and my team runs into. And it's it's interesting how it presents itself. A lot of times, it's a little bit difficult to tell. Usually we can tell right away though, which is one of the things when you're talking to professional journalists or financial journalists, which is interesting to me, is that I feel like this push and emphasis on fake news has really got us back to the basics of journalism. Who's telling me this? Why are you telling me this? What is your agenda? And so that's every time I see a tweet or every time my editors see a tweet, I ask them to answer those questions for themselves in their head. And that tweet, that author of the tweet has to persuade me that what they're saying is real. And if they can't do that, I don't report it. So this is I feel like we're at such a interesting inflection point in the world of journalism, and it kind of, in some ways it's disheartening, but in other ways it really is kind of an exciting time to kind of get back to basics, is what I like to tell my newbies that come on to my staff.
Great. Francine.
Good morning. Still morning. So I'm going to sort of spring off of Sarah's comments. In a few weeks, in April, I'll be 10 years on Twitter. 10 years, yes. I started on Twitter in April of 2008 after starting a blog in 2006. I had left PwC. I am an accountant by training. So I was a practitioner in accounting, audit, consulting, corporate governance, project management, et cetera. And I started writing at the end of 2006, started a blog. And given that I had no connection with a firm or academia, the question was, how do I let people know that I'm writing a blog and get my information out? And some of my former colleagues who were in the systems, software implementation, SAP, Oracle type people, had been talking about Twitter. It took off in popularity at the 2007 South by Southwest conference, where suddenly all these people that were gathered together that were at that time more focused on sort of software and technology than what it is these days. The new digital environment started tweeting, and they started telling me, maybe we should, go over to Twitter. They were on Friendster. Okay, so this was Friendster was the big deal then. And they were coming over from Friendster and trying out Twitter. And because they're technology and software people, they had a lot of influence on the platform to try to tell these guys, here's how it should work, and here's the bugs, and, here's how we want to use it. And so they were very active users. But there was nobody else there. So when we started in 2008, there were no journalists. Imagine Twitter. There were no journalists. There were no PR people. There were no sort of media, influencer types. There were these digital marketing people who were sort of the first adopters of these kinds of tools in social media. And there were certainly no accountants or auditors or lawyers, the people who were my target audience for what I was writing about on my blog, which was the business of the big four public accounting firms. But I looked at it and said, I was always the one who, when you had email listservs or whatever, I was the one re-emailing, stuff to people constantly and getting people cutting me off from their list because I was emailing too much. So this was a natural for me. And I joined and started, distributing my content from my blog, distributing other articles, redistributing other people's stuff. This was great. I mean, I just loved it. And after about 5 years, I had about 11,000 followers. I consider them to be organic. Now, 10 years later, I have about 22,000. I constantly check to make sure that they're real. I review every single person's profile before I follow them back. But I'm not one of those sort of snobby journalists who says I need to have a ratio of people who follow me to people I follow of, 900 to 1 or something. I follow almost everybody back who follows me, unless they're an obvious sort of porn bot, with graphic pornography, or they're some kind of Nazi or, racist or violent or vulgar person or whatever that, And I now have to look much, much, much deeper, much, much more carefully. I have to look at tweets to check people's sort of track record. Whereas you used to be able to look at a profile, and sometimes I would know that they were the accounting students that I go out to visit when I go out to visit schools, MAC programs. I would know, oh, that's an accountant who wants to be anonymous. So I followed eggs back. I followed anonymous people back because I usually knew who they were. I had been out to visit a school, and so I would get a bunch of students who would follow me. Or you'd look at who they follow, and you could see their sort of cohort, and you would say, okay, I know this person is okay. That doesn't work anymore. You really have to be scrupulous. And now that I work for MarketWatch, I joined about 3 years ago. It's my first newsroom job at 53 years old. So media is still alive if you try hard and you push. I am even more careful because I see sort of the tendency for people to target people that have a blue check mark. I got a blue check mark when I joined MarketWatch. That hasn't really changed my life so much, other than the fact that I think if someone wants to target you, they will target you as someone who has some kind of influence, and they'll find a way to find something that you tweeted in the past, whatever that might be, embarrassing, or that might be contrary to what you're saying today. And I've never deleted any of my tweets, so if someday somebody wants to find something that I said that was silly or embarrassing, they'll be able to find it. I consider that part of my, growth and progression. But that's the kind of thing that's happening to a lot of other journalists or anybody who has a public profile. The minute somebody decides that they're, on the wrong side of their cause, they go back and they look for something to embarrass them or something to look and say that they've been contrary. So I try to stick with people who I think have a good intention for wanting to follow me, who want to read what I write. That's still my purpose. My profile has said for the last 10 years, I'm using the tools instead of the tools using me, meaning that I don't work for anybody else. At least that was the case for a while. But I still consider Twitter and other social media, which for me is limited to LinkedIn, I'm not on anything else, not even Facebook, as tools. So they're tools for me to distribute my work, to raise awareness for the things that I write about, and to help others who are writing about similar things or who are writing about things that I'm interested in also distribute their work. But you have to be so much more careful now who you retweet. People are looking to try to catch you. I'm very, very conscious of that. But I'm someone in 10 years who, knock on wood, has never been hacked. Maybe that's the accountant auditor in me. I know how to protect myself. So far, so good. And so far, so good, even if I might talk or say something that people disagree with. I think I get sort of a benefit of the doubt based on my subject matter expertise. They think that it's an honest disagreement, and they don't think that it's a personal disagreement. I've never been harassed as a woman. I've certainly been vehemently disagreed with. And if somebody gets vulgar or violent, then I block them, and I'm a prodigious blocker. I don't even think twice about it. You're blocked, you're out. And, on to the next person. So I think that these are still very valuable tools. I think there's a lot of human nature that comes into play that makes them challenging for some people. I think that those are things that have always been the case. Again, as an accountant and an auditor, people have always been fooled. People have always been fooled by people who are slick. And this is no different. It's just a different medium. And we all have to be more careful as consumers of information. But again, I'm more worried about the large media organizations or the search companies, et cetera, that take care of our data that we don't necessarily choose to provide. So I choose to provide the information judiciously, I hope, on Twitter or on LinkedIn. But when you provide your information for something like, that ends up at Equifax, or your banking information that ends up at one of the large banks, and they abuse that privilege and they don't protect my privacy, I'm more worried about that than I am about somebody making fun of something that I might say on Twitter, or commenting on a picture of my family, or something that I did in good faith and that they decide, somehow to use against me.
Thanks. Well, let me ask the panel a question, and it's going to be framed in very general terms so that you can each. What's the problem? Oh, sorry, Chris.
No worries. I got a easy.
I've already talked to you, so I've already got it, what you said in my head. Chris, please.
Sure. So first, by way of context, I split my time between Columbia and the New York Times. So at Columbia, my research is in machine learning. And at the New York Times, for the past several years, I've been leading a data science group. So one thing I should say by way of disclosure is that although this is called journalist panel, that in terms of the org chart of traditional media with church and state, I'm on state, meaning I'm somebody who's helping the New York Times as best as I can not to go out of business, but I'm not somebody who actually produces or possesses the craft of journalism. So with that disclosure out of the way, I'll agree with everything that was said about fake news being a problematic term. In the last talk we heard about one of the choices for fake news being people knowingly portray things as false. You can see that that's only one corner of a whole persuasion ecosystem, because there's also satire and parody, which is knowingly false, but you're sort of doing it with your co-conspirators rather than to deceive. So I see fake news as one part of a continuum rather than a separable label, which makes the classification problem very difficult for teenagers and for machine learning. There's sort of one corner, which is content that you are claiming is merely to inform, and yet you are doing it to deceive. And that involves us assigning a lot of psychology to the source. But I picture that as part of the same axes as real news, which is presented as though it's true and done collaboratively, and satire, hoax, propaganda in both senses of the word propaganda. Like in the 17th century, when the Vatican was talking about propaganda, it was a good thing. It's only post-World War II that we now have, reclaimed the term propaganda to mean something bad for you. And all of these things, as Edward Bernays knew, were in the same space as PR and advertising. So all of it I think of as persuasive content. Either I'm trying to persuade you something is true, persuading you that you should trust me, or I'm trying to persuade you to buy something or to believe something, or to get out and protest, or to get out and counter-protest. All of those I think of as part of a type of persuasive information. And I use that word in part because of Zeynep Tufekci's phrase, the persuasion architectures. That is, we can no longer separate the way we think about information from the platforms on which we consume information. Those platforms are distributed, highly optimized, full with user-generated content from a variety of non-gatekeeper sources. It's coming from people we know, people we don't know, and many people who present themselves as though they were people you know, but you don't. And that gets back to this point about advertising, that the content that people are seeing online that's problematic is not merely the content for which somebody is paying the platform company to show you. It's also content that sometimes a foreign state actor is paying lots of people to generate in the context of sock puppets or other fabricated personae. So I think of fake news as just one corner, as this sort of general topic of persuasive information. I think the persuasive information cannot be separated from the persuasion architectures, namely the technology that's delivering that information to you. Those persuasive architectures are being operated by private companies, which means we as the market need to think about the very complicated three-party game among private companies, the market, and the government. I use the word game in part because that's the way Janeway describes it in his 2012 book, Doing Capitalism in the Innovation Economy, but also to imply that it's an unstable system. So this is all very, I think, unstable. As we, the market, engage in things that change the ecosystem, for example, by educating ourselves to spot and be inoculated against fake news, all three parties are reacting, and the sort of rules and the flow of information, I think, are going to be very dynamic. I'll stop with that.
Great. And sorry that I
Not at all.
I lost my mind there.
I have lots to learn, so I'm happy to just.
No, but I was going to ask you specifically about what you just said, so it's a good thing the audience got to hear it.
Good.
So I want to put out a question that really all of you will be able to address, but from different perspectives. And it has to do with what I'll broadly call fighting back. And so one thing which I mentioned earlier, one kind of fighting back is creating some sort of systematic accountability through someone who specializes as an intermediary, like NewsGuard, which I mentioned is just getting started. And as an economist, it sounds like that's a good thing. By the way, fake news is not very new. To me as an economist, what's new is that we look like we might be starting to do something about fake news. For example, in an interesting coincidence, the first fake news academic study that I ever saw was written about a decade ago by, guess who, Donald Trump's current head of the Council of Economic Advisors. And it was written about the way that the same economic news story is treated differently by journalists depending on whether it's a Democratic or Republican administration. Now, that has been completely ignored, that story. As far as I can tell, it's never cited, it's never talked about. So now, all of a sudden, we're seeing NewsGuard is going to start rating and providing whatever it calls labels. Sounds like a good thing to me. So that's one thing. Another thing is maybe there are new technologies, I don't know because I'm an old guy, for blocking. You said, you're using the tools, not letting the tools use you. So I'd love to hear more about how those tools are evolving. And then also data science opportunities for fighting back. I guess public policy is one area. You mentioned it sort of obliquely, Chris. But so I think we can all, and maybe go in the same order as you spoke originally, talk a little bit about fighting back. And shouldn't we be, in some sense, from where I'm sitting, I'm feeling more optimistic because I've been waiting for people to want to fight back about accountability in news for a long time.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to bear in mind when we think about fighting back or taking on new tools is, of course, those tools themselves then like the interaction between like the way we react to the situation and then how the situation evolves. So I think that, you know, projects like NewsGuard, and there are other ones that are, you know, trying to do similar things, are really interesting. I think there's also the caveat that, you know, there's also been some signs that when fake news is labeled as fake, people actually are maybe more inclined to believe it in a weird way. There's a bit of a kind of a backlash, or, you know, and you've seen some of that. I mean, Facebook is partnering, as is Google, is partnering with fact checkers, and there's some real problems they found about the way things get labeled, and what that actually does, how people then react, what they retain, and then there's a whole field of psychology about this too. And so, you know, I don't think that means that you shouldn't do these things, but I think you need to be like, I think a lot of this is going to be a work in progress as we figure out. I mean, it's not kind of a one-way street, right? Like you put these things into place, you have whatever nutrition label or red light, green light, you know, that might pop up. You know, and so maybe I think some of the interesting things, I think, are some of the ways that the more subtle ways that people are doing to try to, or the projects people are putting into place to try to highlight the sourcing, to try to increase transparency, or whether it's even just sort of showing, you know, showing in a feed environment where you have a lot of stories, attaching news organizations' logos to those stories, so it does stand out for you. You know, that it's more top of mind. Of course, as journalists, we all love to think that everyone knows our byline and reads it, but sadly, I know and assume that most people aren't really paying any attention, you know, to who wrote the story, you know, if they're reading it in the paper itself, and then certainly in a social media environment, you know, I'm not even sure half the time that they know that they're reading the FT, you know, and so how do you kind of how do you offer a lot more context in that way? And so I think that's going to be the next challenge we see. Is like, it's great we're waking up to that there are actually tools at hand that maybe that we can use, but I think then the next step is going to be, okay, what's the next iteration? How are those tools changing what people think, or what are the ways people are going to game the system? You know, I've heard ideas that, you know, maybe you should incorporate into these, you know, into algorithms and feeds how you're ranking things. You know, how many Pulitzer Prizes has an organization won? Like, how many other awards? But then, you know, does that create an incentive to create a sort of an alt-right version of a Pulitzer? Like, what do you, so you have to think about kind of how these changes are going to reverberate in unexpected ways, and then how you're going to react to those.
I think that one point you just made is really interesting, because in this article that Korvitz wrote explaining why he was setting up this company, he specifically pointed to evidence that readers, right after they read an article, who were asked, what was the brand that you just read, often aren't able to remember. Yep. And so part of his whole business plan is to try to create logos, just as you were saying, and to use perception analysis to make it more salient for people who they're reading. So it's very connected to what you were just saying.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be really important.
Sure.
So I think that, at least in my work, it's not so much that we've created tools to fight back as we have armed our humans with just an incredible amount of critical thinking and being skeptical of the sources that we choose to believe when we follow leads of stories. I think that in traditional journalism, and I mean that by, you know, journalism all of 10 years ago, you know, you had far fewer sources that like a breaking news editor like myself would see, because sources were other people that you would maybe go out and talk to. And, you know, you believe the credibility of your source. You know, you do a lot of different things about, like, how do you believe your source when it's another person? Well, there's all kinds of different things journalists do to, you know, ferret out that sort of relationship. Where now my breaking news editors, I don't know, they probably read 35,000 tweets a day combined, you know, and every single one of those tweets is a source. Hypothetically, it could be. And so they are just constantly going through the motions of, like I said, who is this? Why are they telling me this? Does this make sense? You know, we've had some hoaxes. They've all been hacks, but, you know, it was interesting. You talked about how you've never been hacked, but, you know, the AP was hacked. McDonald's has been hacked. I'm trying to think. The NFL was hacked. And I don't know. I don't know. Do any of you remember the McDonald's tweet that went out about President Trump with the tiny hands? You know, we knew that was not I wish I had it to put up on the screen, but we all knew that was a hack because it just didn't make sense that McDonald's would tweet that. Or when the NFL tweeted that the commissioner had died, #RIP. You know, does a company, if Roger Goodell had actually passed away, would they tweet it? And would they #RIP that? No. So we were able to tell that was indeed a hack. The AP reported, and when I say reported, you shouldn't use that word. The AP was hacked and said that there had been an explosion at the White House and President Obama was injured. And the markets completely tanked on that for a short amount of time. But you know, the White House is one of the most photographed and like live streamed with video camera place ever. We have reporters in the White House. We hadn't heard anything about that, and before we reported that, we called our reporters up and said, is there an explosion there? Like, are you guys seeing anything there? And they're like, no. And so, you know, we didn't report that news because we suspected that it was a hack. So you have human beings on the other side of this technology really looking at this information and assessing whether or not they think it's real or believable, because the tools are fallible. And of course, humans are also fallible, but I think it's really important in this age of digital journalism that we have human beings on the other side to make these sorts of judgment calls. I mean, that's ultimately, when you talk about brands, there are a lot of human beings behind these brands that make decisions every single day, minute by minute, that foster all of our relationships with them and how much we choose to believe them.
Thank you. Francine?
I'm very lucky because my role is to do second day analysis. So something comes out, an enforcement order comes out from the SEC, there's some kind of strange news about a company, and I don't usually spit out a story, you know, a 250-word story or whatever in the first 10 minutes. I don't have to beat anybody. The only time I'm ever worried about beating somebody to a story is if I have an idea and I'm thinking, how could somebody not have thought of this? And I'm just worried that somebody is going to suddenly think of it before I do and get the story out sooner. But usually I can sit on things and I can think about them. I can vet the people that I'm talking to. If I get an idea from social media or see someone that I think is talking about it, I get a chance to call them. I get a chance to check into them. I get a chance to look at their LinkedIn profile. I get a chance to call other people and say if they've ever heard of them. That's a luxury that I have that very few of my colleagues at MarketWatch, for example, have. They'll see something on social media. They'll be worried about missing that piece because MarketWatch is supposed to be putting up any news that can affect the market immediately. And they're worried that if they think twice about it, their readers are going to not see that information when other readers do, and they're going to miss out on an opportunity to react to that with their portfolio or with their investments. And I really feel for them because it is incredibly hard sometimes to discern that. But in my case, you know, I look at, you know, the whole reason why I'm writing instead of working in one of the consulting firms is the reason that I wanted to correct what I thought was misreporting and misinformation that was going out about the issues that I was passionate about, accounting and audit and corporate governance and frauds and scandals and things like that. And I saw a lot of reporters who were perpetuating sort of misinformation about these kinds of things. They were taking old stories and they kept recycling them, or old theories or old ideas, and they would recycle them every time something else would come up. You know, I could go on about Arthur Andersen and how much misinformation there is out there about what happened at that time and why. But I did it because I wanted to make sure that new reporting about these issues was reported accurately with people who actually have the technical expertise to do it. And many reporters don't have the opportunity to do that. I've probably been blocked on Twitter more times by journalists who are sick of me correcting them over and over and over again because they keep talking about how there's a fiduciary legal duty for directors to maximize shareholder wealth. There isn't. And I've worn out my welcome with some journalists on that subject. So I think that it really is incumbent upon news organizations, especially those that have to respond to breaking news, to as Sarah said, have human beings looking at this, to have learning, human learning about the hoaxes or the things that have been perpetuated before, to look at sort of the signals about how people are doing this stuff. And it is kind of sometimes very crude. And a reasonable person will see that crudity, and you have to make sure that you can weather the storm of somebody saying, why didn't you report that story, and be able to say, because it was false, because we would have been sorry, because it's not worth it, because it would put something, unfortunately, in Google, in the media, in the tool that then other people can reuse and reperpetuate that false information. And that is the thing that has to stop, is the reuse of this information because it's out there, and sort of trying to get that out of the, I don't know, the algorithm, so that it's down on the bottom and people don't see it when they first Google. I used to say that when I would report stuff, if you wanted to try to find something, you needed to go to like the 5th page, because if you grab what comes up on the first page often, that's often, you know, skewed. It's often skewed. And that's unfortunately what a lot of people and a lot of journalists do, is they grab because they're in a hurry, and they don't sometimes have the subject matter expertise to discern.
I mean, one of the things about machines is that they're great for imposing consistency and discipline in the way things are read. So I'm sort of noticing that human beings, I'm not saying we can replace them, but human beings combined with machinery can really check their own biases too, and make sure they get to page 5. So
Right.
That's why I was sort of thinking there might be some technologies. And now, Chris, you're the expert on data science. What are your thoughts?
Oh man, there's so much to work with there. People won't go to page 5 if it's optimized and personalized. So part of the experience of going to Google and looking on the first page is, your first page is different from my first page. So Google has had decades now of experience of making sure that you will see on your first page something that you are likely to engage with, and that's likely to be something that you agree with, right? And Facebook even more so, because it's not constrained by search results. It can just grab any user-generated content from any of the 2 billion monthly active users. So although technology can be useful for creating uniformity of facts and resources, personalization destroys that, right? Because the whole idea of personalization is, I'm not giving you the same facts. I'm giving everybody alternative facts, which will optimize some KPI. And that KPI is usually decided by a product designer. It's engagement, clicks, retweets, shares, some other sort of digital thing that is itself generating data for the algorithm, rather than, say, optimizing for trust. And
but that's all in Google's brand. But Google couldn't take an article with a brand from a major news organization and edit it, right?
The platform wouldn't, but if the platform is feeding you user-generated content, then the platform, whether it's Google or anybody else, will happily hand you a piece of content that's been altered by anybody, right? And that's just Photoshop. I don't even need advanced tech to take to generate the brand for the Denver Gazette, for example, a totally fictitious publication, and serve it up to you, right? So I don't think the logo is going to prevent us from being shown fake stuff.
Could you explain that? I'm confused by that. Why, with the absence of the logo of a reputable firm, they couldn't put, let's say, a reputable, like FT logo couldn't be on an edited thing that Google had edited, could it?
So if you go to a gateway company like the New York Times, then you have some trust that that company is not going to be presenting to you some manipulated content. If you're going to any platform company who's serving up user-generated content, then the user-generated content could be an altered image, right? I can slap anybody's logo on any piece of content, or I can make a fictitious logo that just looks truthy, or I can take a journalist's tweet and just write something else entirely on it and Photoshop it.
So then the gateways have to be places that generate brands too. Isn't that the answer?
Gateways could take a more active role in thinking about the trustworthiness of the content that you see. However, gateways actively resist that for a couple of reasons, including scale, right? So part of the glory of algorithms is that we do things that scale. So if you're Facebook, you don't want to have human beings slowing things down by reviewing the content. And the real fear of regulation, right? As soon as you do something that can be interpreted as selective suppression of misinformation, selective suppression of any information, then you open yourself up to the possibility that you will have bad PR, bad litigation, bad regulation, fear of litigation, fear of regulation, and all of those things are keeping the platform companies quite distant from doing anything that involves mediating content other than things that we've all agreed are okay, like making sure that there's no child pornography or copyright infringement. YouTube will take down a video that has some copyrighted song in a few milliseconds, but it will not take down conspiracy theories and just total hoaxes.
I had to operate on that theory when I was operating a blog. So I had a website, read the auditors, and you think that the people that are coming are, good people, right? Auditors, right? Kind of, milk a toast, kind of riskless people. And instead, I operated on the theory that as long as I didn't comment on something, or change or alter or edit something that somebody put in a comment, that I was safe from someone saying that I was controlling or somehow manipulating that. I was responsible for the content that I put on it. I had very few guest posts, but sort of staying out of that, looking at comments especially and editing them or somehow deciding which ones get on or off. It was either a go or no go. You had to then create user, rules that said certain things just are a no go, and it's sort of unilateral, and I'm not going to, second guess myself about it, and it's just off, or certain people are banned. Fortunately, 12 years now, I've never had a problem, but I always worried about the kinds of issues that you're talking about, people infiltrating the site with something that then I would end up being held responsible for.
So your original question is about striking back and how do we strike back. Ideas that I've seen since election that are flawed include things where it doesn't take into account people's cognitive biases, and for example, just flagging something as false just doesn't take into the fact that a lot of people will say, well, I don't believe the fact checkers, or that, they said it's false and therefore it must be true, or they said that thing is false and therefore everything else that doesn't have a red arrow next to it is true. There's all sorts of cognitive biases that won't be taken into account. Things that have no market demand. So I've heard lots of people suggest companies that would do this where there's absolutely no reason why anybody would pay for that, and so that's not a sustainable idea. Or things that have a tech problem. And the major tech problem for these fake news solutions is not that it's hard. Jan LeCun was on record immediately after the election saying, sure, we could solve fake news. It's just a question of how to deploy it, and that's not my department. It's not that it's technically hard. It's that technology always has unintended consequences, and some of them are just sort of oversight consequences, like, oh, we didn't think that is what we were going to optimize for when we optimized this thing. And some of them are adversarial. So every time you make an open platform, every time you hear the word open, think exploitable. So every time somebody says, oh, we're going to make the world more open, think exploitable. That's what it means to make an open technology. It means that you're not thinking about adversarial intent and how people are going to misuse that platform in ways that to the detriment of other people who are using those platforms. So there's a very rapidly populating graveyard of bad ideas for solving fake news, most of which I think are felled by one of those three problems. In terms of how are we going to do it, again, I think about things in terms of this three-party game of the governments, the platform companies, and the markets. Within the market, which is like us and other companies that are not platform companies, there's lots of room for education, and there's lots of room for forensics. The forensics particularly is useful to the fourth and fifth estate, meaning mainstream media and bloggers. So there's plenty of people, including in this building, who are using plenty of technology for elucidating how these platform companies work, auditing algorithms, algorithmic accountability are terms that you hear among data journalists, exposing that in the form of, a Medium post or mainstream media, or sometimes a Medium post that gets picked up by mainstream media, is very useful for the dynamic game in which the market becomes less sensitive to and more inoculated from misinformation generally, and has weak effect on government. What is the role of government here? Well, it's to set the guardrails. There's extremely heterogeneous role of government in persuasive information, heterogeneous both in time and in geography. So right now in Europe, there's active regulation around GDPR, for example. There's interest in many of the states in protecting consumers, for example, protecting consumers from fraudulent bots. That was one example from, again, coming from work done in this building in the New York State after New York Times, with the help of Columbia journalists, exposed in great and beautiful detail, the way bots on Twitter were used to impersonate people. New York State expressed interest in criminally prosecuting people for misrepresenting people. So that's one example of how regulation can happen not just at the federal level. And remember that regulation is useful even if it doesn't happen. Fear of regulation is one way that causes any company to self-regulate. Self-regulation is very dangerous because if you allow companies to regulate themselves, they'll come up with little band-aids over small parts that are not business sensitive. For example, when somebody says that the advertising spend was only however many hundreds of thousands of dollars, which for Facebook is de minimis, that focuses attention on advertising rather than many hundreds of people funded by a state actor in order to generate misinformation sock puppets. So if a foreign state is willing to put money into it, they don't actually need to give the money to Facebook as a marketing tool. They can just hire people to promote, for example, protests and counter-protests at the same time. So within that three-party game, there's lots that we can do to constrain the platforms, including not giving them money, not giving them talent. There's lots of things that platforms can do to change things. For example, every few months, Facebook says we're retuning our algorithm, and those algorithms are extremely good at optimizing for something. They just have to be very careful about what they're optimizing for. In general, if they're optimizing for clicks or engagement, there are all sorts of unintended consequences in addition to the exploitable consequences. Very different is what media, particularly media that are engaging in a subscription model, are optimizing for. So the phrase Aaron Pillhofer, my former colleague at the New York Times, uses is optimizing for trust. What does it look like when a company tries to optimize for trust? If you think about the subscription model, that is a long-term relationship, and that's a very different optimization principle than most platform companies are engaged in.
Thank you. I think we should now open the floor for questions. And what I'd like to do, we have about 10 minutes, I think. But what I'd like to do is ask people, so that we can get a lot of questions, ask you to be short in your questions, and then maybe we'll collect up a few questions and then just give the panelists a chance to respond to whichever of the questions they like. So I think we'll do it 3 at a time. So let's collect 3 questions and then run those by the panel. We'll start with this, and then Matt, you're next.
Thank you. So real quick, it's on the definition, Shannon, that you alluded to regarding fake news, and specifically not misinformation, but slant. So how, I'm hearing brands, I'm hearing platforms. I grew up in a place where if it came from a certain source, it wasn't trusted, no matter what you said, no matter how factual. And the subscription model, how do you build that long-term trust if people only watch certain channels in this part of the country and people only watch certain channels in the other?
Mm-hmm. Building trust in the echo chamber. Yeah. Matthew.
So a lot of what goes under the guise of news is really entertainment. I mean, the amount that times people spend watching cable TV or staring at the internet is, I think, not, their objective is not just to learn something or be informed, it's to be entertained. Presumably the people selling that know that too. So how does the fact that there's this very gray boundary between news and entertainment affect problems and solutions?
There was a lot of talk about filtering and screening in order to fight back against fake news. Another way of fighting back would be to drown out fake news with real news. So for example, in the fake tweet case for the White House, you could, instead of just not displaying a story about the fake tweet, you could actually post a story about, oh, we have reporters in the White House that say there is no explosion in the White House. And then competition amongst these different sources and stories could hopefully play itself out in a productive way.
And one table back.
Yeah, 2 things sort of adding on to the others. One, to this point, I was driving on the train this morning and saw the graffiti, right? You paint out the graffiti. Is there a way to paint out the fake news? And then the second point is that how do you deal with this problem where if you know a story well, you know it's widely misreported because there's details, there's things that are missing. Just following sports, right? And so you sort of tune things out, and there's this fall into this world of distrust. How do you combat that? How do you regain the integrity of the Fourth Estate?
Okay, let's stop there. That's 4 questions. Let's go down again in order.
Sure. So I think actually a couple of these questions touch on similar things, which is this question of the filters that we all have, and about whether it's about bias, whether it's about how do we enact filters to protect ourselves, and also then how do we break out of filters that we maybe haven't realized we've opted into, but that we have to, because frankly, there's just information overload, right? I mean, if I was to try to read every tweet on my feed, I don't know that, it wouldn't, yes, some things would get drowned out, but presumably some false information would get drowned out, but I don't know that I would actually retain anything useful out of that. And so I think, some of this, the way I think about it personally, as a news consumer and as somebody who has to consume news for my job in order to stay on top of, the sectors I'm trying to cover, is actually opting out more, like opting out of social media when I can, and not trying and talking to real people, seeing kind of what bubbles up actually not on social media and in real life, and in whether it's going away when you go away for the weekend or going on a vacation and deleting Twitter from my phone and assuming that if stories are important, they're going to come to me in a way that probably is more vetted. I mean, that's essentially the argument that Farhad Manjoo made in his column this week for the Times. That was all about not consuming news on social media for 2 months. But of course that doesn't, it's hard, at the same time I'm saying I try to do this and we should try to do this. It doesn't really reflect the reality that we live in now. And I don't have a good answer, and I don't have a good answer either for figuring out how we should convince people, like we as people at news organizations should convince people that, we don't have a bias, or at least, I actually don't even think it's fair to say we don't have a bias, but just to say, this is who we are. This is the point of view we're coming from. This is why we're telling the story in this way. And then you kind of have to choose whether or not we are a platform that you're going to believe, or we are a brand, whether it's an individual journalist brand or the news organization's brand. I think we need to do a better job of it. And I haven't heard great solutions to doing that. So I'm sort of just as stuck as you are, I think, to a degree.
We did write that story. We did, yeah. Yeah, the filtering is, it's hard because I personally want to see everything. Everything that I possibly can, I want to see it, because I feel comfortable enough in my own ability to filter in my own brain, what's real, what's not, what I think is important and what's not. It's different for me than for your regular consumer of news, obviously, just because this is my job and that's what I do. I think just to answer most of your questions, I have the luxury of working for an outfit that is very like cause and effect. If the news that I provide on the Bloomberg terminal isn't correct or isn't what my consumers want, I know about it right away. And that's something that I think a lot of people that don't have the subscription model, they don't have that. But so I'm unique. I think Bloomberg is, and there's a few others of us, we're unique in that sense. So that helps a little bit in some of it.
Thanks, Francine.
Just the one piece about the echo chamber. So I used to write reported commentary for American Banker, and my point of view was pretty clear on the issues that I wrote about. But it was reported commentary. When I got to MarketWatch, they said you need to do reporting. Okay, so no opinion, no it's reporting. However, if you read it, you probably could discern my point of view perspective. And I'm the kind of person who, if I see that, one side is talking smack and it's just not right, I'm not going to include that in the story. Whereas I think a lot of other outlets are really into this idea that there has to be some voice or some balance to both sides, and I'm the typical accountant. If it's wrong, it's wrong. I'm not going to include it. And I would love to see more of that. But despite that, if you looked at some of my stories, which I think are completely bland, about securities regulation or, the markets and an accounting, disclosure from a company. I mean, you try to just straight report that. You try to add information. You try to give good comment, sources, people to comment on the topic. And yet you look at the comment section, and one person will be calling me some super libtard, And the other person will be calling me, typical MarketWatch, conservative, pro-capitalist, blah, 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 And I'm like, did you even read the article? And I can be called, both sides of the spectrum for the same article, which I tried very hard to just be explanatory and informative and as accurate as possible because my audience is going to catch me in an error if I make it. And I look at that and I say, you know what? Whatever. Because I can't fight the ignorance of the reader. I can only try to keep working to inform them and raise the bar. I am not going to lower myself to that low least common denominator. I'm going to keep trying to raise the bar. And I guess I might not live long enough, but hopefully some others who are trained by good schools like this will live long enough to see the bar raised up again and for people to stop being, attracted to the crap and the self-fulfilling prophecy of stories that just keep regurgitating crap and people who keep reusing crap and keep, infiltrating our sources of information with crap. I try to add something to the area that I cover that has value and hope that spreads, and I do my damnedest on Twitter to send it out.
Briefly, drowning out real news with fake news is very difficult on information platforms because people will always brigade to create a false narrative. For example, if a bunch of people to get together on one platform and say, okay, let's go to that other platform and flood the zone with a particular counter narrative, or if a state actor funds a bunch of people to do it. So we can't do it just by retweeting ourselves many times. Rather, it's up to platform companies to decide that they're going to upweight things that are likely true rather than upweight things that are popular, right? So the phrase for this sometimes is, if it trends, it's true. So if somebody makes something trend on Twitter, even if the rest of the cycle is correcting it, there's well-documented cognitive bias problems about trying to convince people to learn the truth once they've anchored their worldview around a falsehood. So I don't know that we as individuals just retweeting ourselves telling the truth are going to be able to overcome state actors or people who have a monetary interest in pushing false. However, I do think that platform companies could do that if they're very careful. And again, careful means, there's plenty of research in cognitive psychology about how to avoid backfire effect when somebody believes something that's false and you try to tell them the truth. It's very delicate trying to tell them the truth in a way that doesn't cause them to entrench their false position. But I do think that even just changes in phrasing, there's plenty of research about how just changing the way you tell people the truth when they believe something false can carefully deprogram them from counterfactual reality.
But if they want to block you, you're just going to have to suck it up.
Individuals can certainly block you, yes.
I think one of the themes that now that we have to close because we're out of time, but one of the themes that really came out of this, at least in my mind, is that, well, first of all, I think journalists are doing their job, at least at outlets as good as the ones we've been talking about, and that's very reassuring. But I think the other thing that all of you have said in one form or another is that consumers have to do their job too. In some sense, what you can't control is, if somebody doesn't want to be careful in what they read, then they're going to invite people to supply things that maybe are entertainment. And I'm not sure how much we need to worry about that. That's something certainly we can't control, right? If somebody wants to read garbage, garbage will be supplied. So I'm more optimistic, thinking that the conversation that matters is the one that is being supplied by people who are being careful and that we can tune into if we want to. So on that note, let's end.